and welcome to CommieCast, the podcast series which looks at the issues which matter to you. This is the third of our little series, well, I say little series, very big series on the housing crisis. Some would say the housing emergency. I'm joined again by Ruth Stiles and by Lorraine Douglas, and today we're going to talk about solutions. We've done two other episodes in the series. Well, obviously this is the third one, and we talked about how we got here. Now we need to talk about actually what we can do. And we've certainly implied some of the solutions in our previous conversations about the problem. All right, but now we're going to talk specifically about what we can do here. Lorraine, can I go to you first? Right, you're in charge of housing. What would be the first thing that you would do to rectify where we are now?
Well, the Communist Party's developed a housing charter, which has got some fairly detailed proposals in it for getting out of the situation that we're in now. Obviously, the headline is build more council housing and build a lot more council housing than we're getting at the moment, which we know will help to actually drive overall delivery of housing because it will boost the private sector's incentive to deliver if they are actually going to be in competition with homes that are going to be available at social rent. But in order to get there, there are a lot of things that need to happen. We need to see housing finance being reformed so that mass council housing development programme can actually happen. At the moment, the regulations governing public sector housing finance are so restrictive that it actually gets in the way of local authorities developing at scale. We have to stop the sale of public land to private developers. And where we know that land banking is happening, where we can see that is happening because parcels of housing land have been sitting undeveloped for lengthy periods of time, that we want to use compulsory purchase orders, see local authorities using CPOs to get that land back into public ownership or into public ownership. We need to see a progressive taxation on the value of vacant land and on the value of properties, and we need to be taxing owners of those resources where that land is sitting there either undeveloped or being deliberately left vacant. We want local authorities to also use their compulsory purchase powers to acquire and refurbish long-term empty and substandard properties and also housing land for social use, and that can include unused retail and commercial space. We need to also recognise that in rural areas there is a huge housing problem developing with the sale of holiday homes and second homes to people who are already adequately housed, and we need to see local authorities having the powers to restrict the sale of second homes in areas of housing stress and housing need. We want to look at getting the ex-council voluntary transfer housing association stock and also the arm's length management stock back into local authority control and ownership. And we need to ensure that socially rented housing is genuinely affordable by local authorities being able to set affordability levels within national frameworks. And most importantly, to get direct labour organisations and in-house design and development expertise reinstalled into local authorities so that there is proper democratic control of what is actually being developed and being designed in our local communities. I mean, there are loads, there's quite a lot, and maybe we can do this in chunks really, because I think it will be difficult otherwise for folk to sort of hang on to the details, as it were.
Thanks. So, Lorraine, tell me how important you think it is that we sort out the financial sector and its relationship with the housing market here.
I think it's got to be a prerequisite, really. We need to get back to a situation where finance capital is not able to effectively control the price of housing. which it is at the moment, and it does that through several different ways. I mean, it is in the financial sector's interest to see the value of housing or the price of housing accruing almost exponentially, given that around 80% of the country's wealth is now actually invested in property. So they have vested interests here, and we're not going to get control back of the market without actually imposing the same sorts of financial regulations that were in existence before Thatcher deregulated the housing finance sector completely. And, you know, we lost the housing, the mutuals, the building societies, which were the principal lenders of housing money, and the financial limits that were actually placed on what could be lent for home ownership. You know, that once you lift that and you effectively say it's an open book, when people can get 110% mortgages or 120% mortgages, as they were able to do during the 1990s, you were building a crisis in housing immediately by doing that. And that's all about interest. That's all about finance capital increasing its own value, as it were.
Lorraine, thanks very much. Ruth, over to you. You a housing minister. You've taken the job on after Lorraine's been kicked out for excessive cruelty to kulaks. So you've got the job. What do you do now?
Well, I agree with every word Lorraine said about the big headline, of course, is more council housing. But there are two other areas which are extremely important, which are linked to all of this, one is planning, and how government effectively has centralised planning controlling in some ways, handed it over to developers. We need to tackle the development. In some ways, we need to relax the planning regulations. In other places, we might need to tighten them up. I'm no planning expert, but I'm sure that is absolutely essential in order to do it. And of course, the second part of this is about you have to do something about welfare benefits. People who can't afford to pay their rent is the biggest cause of homelessness, with sky-high rents in the private rented sector. So we need to have a proper welfare system. Well, I'd take the term welfare out of it, a social security system that guarantees people sufficient to live on and to meet their outgoings. I mean, it's an utter nonsense that we've got this bedroom tax, which severely impacts people who need a carer living at home. So this is where you effectively lose housing benefit because you've got someone else living in the household. There's a series of these ridiculous rules. And also we need to tackle the sanctions regime, which is nothing more than punishment for the poor, quite frankly. So that's two big chunks. But the third chunk that needs to happen is we need to regulate the private rented sector. We need to enable local authorities to get proper registration, have the powers to intervene when they don't, and have the staffing resources, by the way, to do this. But also what we need to do is we need the rents to be controlled. Let's go back to rent controls, because an awful lot of landlords are letting properties which are substandard and charging sky-high rents for them. So I think those are broadly the kind of headline stuff that I would go for, because without those, you can't get the balance in it, because basically building council housing again, there's going to be interim periods. So we need to make sure that we tackle the underlying crisis where people can't get access to homes, where private rented sector is sky high or they can't afford to live in it. So there's quite a lot of work that can be done around all of those issues, quite frankly. I'll leave it there for the minute, Stewart. So if you want to come back with something else.
Right, thanks for that. Yeah, just checking up some figures there. And the figures are astonishing, actually. Evictions from private tenancies account for 78% of the rise in homelessness since 2011. I think a lot of people don't actually appreciate that. This is a major transformation from, well, the world that the three of us grew up in which pretty much everybody, not everybody, but everybody we knew lived in a council home. And like I have said before in this series, when I first came to London, Late 70s, early 80s, there was nothing like a housing crisis in London. You could get a place easily. But since then, and this has been as a result of the deliberate policy decisions by the governments, and it's important to remember here that Labour governments have done nothing to overturn the situation. They have bought in to the idea that home ownership is important and that the most important thing in the housing market is preserving the value of people's houses or letting it rise because people feel better whenever the house prices are going up. And this has been, well, it's given us a situation now in which someone like my daughter, who gets a pretty good whack for somebody at her age, she struggled for a long time to find anywhere to live, and she will probably not be able to buy a place until sometime into her mid-30s, given the way things are going now. And of course, the consequence of this is a massive increase in housing benefit. I forget exactly what proportion of GDP the housing benefit is. I will find that later on and stick it in the documentation for the website. But that's something that could be resolved if we were to go ahead and do some of the things that you guys are talking about. It's important to remember, I think, that when you go ahead and build houses, you do actually have a massive supply chain which goes into building a house, and that generates work in itself. That work in itself can go ahead and take people off the dole queue. Capital economics here said, if you were to go ahead and build, say, 300,000 affordable homes per year, after 20 years, that program would begin to create a surplus for the government because you'd make savings on housing benefit, as well as the other economic benefits accruing from that situation. Okay, demographics. Let's talk some demographic and related issues here. Ruth.
Well, the key issue, let's start with the basics first of all, which is that in every local authority area, they need to be collecting information in order to make sure they've got their services tailored to meet the needs of their local population. But of course, as we said in one of the previous podcasts, quite frankly, they don't have the resources to do anything, so there isn't a lot going on. And there's been a huge shift in demographics since the last serious lot of council house building, because there are a lot more single households. There are a lot more people with specific housing needs, which legally have to be provided for in terms of the disabled. And of course, we need to look at how we try and keep the elderly from having to go into care homes miles away from where they live and actually stay where their family is so they get support at home. So there's a whole range of reasons why demographics are extremely important. But the electoral reform bill, which recently went through, by the way, is a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare because what it does is two things. The first thing it does is on the basis of levelling up each constituency to an average number, right? What they've actually done is create a situation where basically automatically the Tories will get another 8 seats, for example. And the way in which they've drawn those boundaries deliberately divide working class areas to dilute the vote. It's absolutely deliberate. It's absolutely blatant. I mean, if you look at what's going on. So that's the first part of it. And the second part of it, of course, is requiring voters to have ID in order to exercise the right to vote. Now, a significant proportion, minority, but a significant proportion, have no photo ID in their possession. A passport costs, what, 85 quid plus? A lot of people don't possess one as a result of that because they don't have the resources to travel in any event. And it hits specifically Black and ethnic minority people, people who are extremely poor and have never had to use photo ID for any purpose. And it also hits the elderly who, quite frankly, have not renewed passports and other things because they haven't needed them. And it also hits other minority groups who, for a range of reasons, don't want to have photo ID. I mean, what this is, in a way, is forcing a national identity system on the country without actually legislating for it, for people to carry ID cards. But the consequences for voting is enormous. It's going to put off people from voting, which means the democratic arrangements will be badly impacted, which of course means that working class people who need housing and the black and ethnic minority community who need accounting for within the housing market particularly, and the disabled, are not in a position to politically influence the decisions which are being taken by exercising a vote at elections. So there's huge implications around the electoral reform bill. I mean, I'm totally opposed to all of this because it is gerrymandering by any other name, quite frankly, what they've done. But more generally, in terms of demographics, we need to return to a position where there's a well-resourced local authorities who can actually properly carry out demographic audits in their localities and use those to devise local planning, I don't know what you call it, documents, basically, plans, basically, local planning plans, which actually take account of what's going on in their locality. I mean, if you take, for example, that it's going to take you between 3 to 5 years to build the amount of council housing you're going to need. In between, you need to be constantly checking whether or not what you're building is, you're planning to build on a rolling programme, is going to meet the needs of local people. And there is actually a significant increase in the number of people who are disabled in our society. And they are very poorly provided for and accounted for in terms of any building, in any planning and everything else. Everybody concentrates on care. Nobody concentrates on where they live and what type of housing they need. And of course, if you think about it, with the pandemic and COVID-19, there is a prediction that there could be up to 2 million people who are permanently disabled as a result of catching COVID, where they're going to be left with brain and other injuries that are life-threatening and will be with them for a very long time to come. So funding for local authorities is essential. Planning, engaging local people, trade unions, local community groups, etc., and local people in building local plans that reflect the needs, local authorities doing the demographics, and then planning with the other things we've talked about, like land, etc., and having the resources to go into a building program. And by the way, in any building, I want to see direct labour organisations, not handed over to private sector companies. In the short term, that won't happen because, of course, all the talent and skill that was existing in local authorities is now gone. So there's going to be a whole lot of things around training and bringing people in and slowly building those things so that you've got the architects and everybody else and engineers, etc., employed by the local authorities. But I think that gives a kind of like overview of the kind of things that I think are important.
Yeah, it is very important because I think it's fair to say, well, it's more than fair to say, over the last 30 or 40 years, the housing market has not been responsive to the needs of the people on the ground. The housing market has responded very much to the needs of the property and the financial sector in terms of generating dough. If we make it more difficult for local people to exert any influence over these people, then we'll lose control completely. I mean, it's a market which is now dominated by the interest of the property and the financial sector. We'll come on to that a little bit later. Lorraine, any thoughts on local democracy and how we can improve things from here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've identified, and indeed not just us, is the way that the organised tenants movement had effectively been destroyed, I think it would be fair to say, as a result of conscious decisions by national government and at local authority level to pretty well clientise any form of tenant involvement in what local authorities are doing. We know that housing associations are not at all keen on tenants associations and don't do anything to actually enable tenants to get organised. that I think is symptomatic, really, of the undermining of local democracy generally. We're seeing local government hollowed out. We're seeing the ability of elected local authorities to exert any meaningful influence over placemaking, for want of a better phrase, and over the prioritisation of services by centralisation of control by central government, ironically claiming that they're giving power back to local people, but not actually delivering any mechanism for them to exercise such power. We're seeing, I think, the steady erosion of the ability of local people to have any sort of influence on what happens in their local areas. You know, we've seen it with things like what's being done in the road systems in London at the moment, and South East London, you know, is absolutely diabolical to try and get around at the moment with the, you know, temporary cycle lanes and bus lanes and goodness knows what, causing absolute chaos and increasing congestion. Local people haven't been consulted about this. You know, there was no input whatsoever into the decisions of the GLA and indeed local authorities to set up these low traffic neighbourhoods and so on and so forth, or to consider, you know, what impact that might have in the short term on, you know, people's ability to get about. So I'm not confident that what we have at the moment is going in the right direction. What we do need, of course, is for tenants to start getting organised again. And we're starting to see this happening, particularly in the private sector, with organisations like the London Renters Union and organisations like Acorn actually starting to get active and involved around housing. And we're also starting to see this emerging, I think, within the social housing sector as well, in no small part because in local authorities, every council estate, you can assume, is going to have a significant proportion of private renters living on it. Every single council housing estate does now because of the right to buy. And so it should become far easier, I think, to start organising and mobilising tenants to get organised for themselves. And of course, there are now moves. I think local government, particularly Labour authorities, are starting to realise actually there is a need for, you know, to facilitate tenants organising and starting to make demands for themselves. So that's one of the areas that we need to go, I think.
We're talking quite a bit about renters here and renters' rights, and certainly more can be done at the local level if more people get involved, etc. But we do have a fairly serious, I guess, macro problem here, because the fact that people can't afford to buy a place means that they're pushed into the private market. And private rents in London, we talked about this earlier, but let's now expand upon it. Recent figures that I looked at showed that the cost of renting in London now accounts for 75% of the average salary post-tax. So once you've paid your tax, your rent will eat up 75% of your income. Now that's increased by about 34% since the turn of the century. 20 years ago, average rent accounted for, I think, 29% of the average income in England. In London, it was 41%. Right, so this has gone insane, and this affects obviously other businesses too, because that means all that money going on rent isn't being spent elsewhere. So it would appear to be in the interest of the economy in general to do something about this, but such is the power of the property and finance interests that run the Tories, and to a certain extent, such is the, I guess, I don't think enough people realise the gravity of the situation. Lorraine, what would you say to people that say you can't introduce rent control because it will just mean there's no properties left on the market? You'll put rent control in place, nobody else will have a private property out to market. Respond, please.
Well, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing because it means then that those private landlords are going to have to dispose of those properties on the market. If you end up with a glut of properties coming onto the market, that's going to have a downward pressure on house prices. So from my perspective, I don't see a downside to that. I mean, it is ironic, isn't it, that after 12 years of Tory government, we've actually seen home ownership as a proportion of overall tenures drop by about 2%. since 2010. So what we're actually seeing is the acquisition of more and more homes in the hands of landlords and fewer homes in the hands of owner-occupiers. That's one thing that's happening. And the net result of that is not just to impoverish people who have no option but to rent because they can't get a mortgage because the house prices are too high, even though the mortgages will almost always be less than they'd be paying in rent. It's not just that, it's also about the explosion of hidden households throughout the country as the next generation are unable to move on and set up home on their own. And you're now seeing the growth of 2 and 3 generation, in some cases, adult households, because none of them can afford to move out and leave their poor parents alone. Now, where we go with that, if we don't see a radical change, I think is that the situation is bound to become very untenable, very untenable. We're likely to see the birth rate go down. What we are starting to see is the conversion of more and more family-sized accommodation into houses in multiple occupation or very small studio flats. And that in part reflects the growth of single adult households that we've had in the country as well. But in no way do those kinds of developments actually meet the need of single adults. I mean, it's essentially student type accommodation, but being occupied by people in their 30s and 40s, singletons in their 30s and 40s, who can't afford anything else. So, yeah, I've forgotten what the original question was, but, we've got some significant things to get a grip of here.
I think, that certainly answered the original question. Whatever it was, I almost forgot myself as well there too. What about Sorry,
can
go
I
ahead,
say
Ruth.
something here? Because there is another group of people, of course, who need to be where, if I was a minister in government, the situation is here, and that's the cladding scandal for leaseholders, where they're basically living in fire traps. And the government disgracefully has done nothing about it to make the people responsible pay for it. Now, the other thing is talking about local democracy. Community associations, which represent all tenure groups and pick up local issues, is a way that could really make a big difference, because it will pick up the owner occupiers, who a large proportion of which are terribly worried about the housing crisis because their kids and grandchildren have got nowhere to live. It will pick up the issue relating to the leasehold scandal around cladding, and it will pick up the issue around tenants and private renting. Now, it seems to me that that's a useful model of trying to organise and involving local trade unions, local trades councils, and other interested groups who are perhaps campaigning on single issue arrangements. But on the private rented sector, well, you asked the question, Stewart, what if somebody said to me that it's impossible to do because it will just result in there being no property? Well, it won't if you have the right law in place, where essentially regulation of private sector is across the board, not selectively. And if you leave your property empty for more than X months, you get whacked with a tax and a large council tax. That's the disincentive. And quite frankly, Lorraine's right. Even if they were to withdraw from the rental market, the reality is it will have a beneficial effect in knocking house prices down. Sorry, I wanted just to come in to make sure leaseholders and broader issues are brought in.
Now, good intervention and fits seamlessly into my little bit here about BTL, which kind of backs up what you said. Sorry, buy-to-let mortgages. Introduced in 1996, they went from 0 to 16.5% of all mortgage advances by 2015. Private landlords now reckon they own about 1 in 5 homes in Britain. So you guys are, unsurprisingly, of course, quite right. Were they to go ahead and get rid of their houses, then there would be a depreciation in house prices, something I think most of us would welcome. Certainly people who have kids still at home that you can't get rid of. The National Housing and Planning Association found that buy-to-let led to a 7% increase in house prices between 1996 and 2007. I'm not sure what the figures are right now. The BTL market has gone down to a certain extent. And also people forget that it was the 1988 Act that changed pretty much everything. In the old days, we had controls on what private landlords could do, but we had a proper supply of public housing as well. We didn't have this reliance upon the private sector, which has, of course, led to some of the issues that we're facing right now. Okay, so let's talk about speculation in housing. We'll talk about overseas investors in a minute. Let's talk about people at the moment speculating in land, because I think something like 81% of the increase in house prices has been attributed to people investing in land. That means an awful lot of our land that was public land has now been bought by speculators. Lorraine, over to you first on this one, please.
Yeah, the traditional costing model for building is a third the cost of land, a third the cost of materials, and a third the cost of labour. And then on top of that, the developers will want a 30% return on what the cost of building is. If we've seen land prices increase exponentially, always linked to development rights. Certain types of land are actually dirt cheap. Greenfield land is not expensive, agricultural land is not expensive, amenity land is expensive, and so is housing land, and industrial development land also carries a price. But if land prices have gone up by 82% over a period of time, then that's increasing, the proportion of the cost of building attributable to land values is also going up proportionately. So what you have to do, of course, is to get a grip of that, and the way of dealing with that is to actually bring land ownership, bring land into public ownership rather than allowing private ownership of land. You could, of course, the government could take the decision to nationalise the entire country, but you can imagine the squeals going up from the squires and lords and ladies owning all of those grouse moors up in the wilder parts of Britain and Scotland, going berserk. So you're not going to get that, because the landed gentry is, of course, part of the Tory party. So we're not going to get any sort of agreement, I think, to wrest control and ownership of land away from the people who stole it in the first place.
I think we're talking about some fairly big macro issues again, which I guess is a theme of this podcast. We can go ahead and nip away at certain elements of the housing market, but the real big problems are a function of the inequality of wealth and income in our society, and the political priorities are obviously directed by the people with the dosh and the influence. Ruth, what would you do about the land situation?
Well, it doesn't matter where you live, right? Go for a walk around your locality and find out how many plots of land are just sitting empty. Now, some of them are small, it's true. Some of them are quite big. And I know in my locality, for example, within about a 10-minute walk of my house, there are about 3 of them. And that's just in my little short walk between me and the local railway station. So I was curious about a couple of these because they've been vacant for a long time. In I think 2 of the cases, they were previously owned by the local authority, but the local authority had handed the land had been sold off to a developer who was then just sitting on it basically and doing nothing with it. Land banking, waiting for land prices to increase. The third one had been in private ownership for a long time and has got into dereliction. Why aren't we just compulsory purchasing it? Bring it back into use and build some housing and something useful for local people. I mean, in my area, there's things like community facilities that are missing and absent. That's another area. Play areas for children. A whole lot of stuff, and community gardens and allotments. There's huge, huge, huge demand for land use to benefit communities. We've got to stop these spivs, because that's what they are. They're spivs. They buy up dirt cheap They hoard and hoard and hoard, and then they sell when the market's at the highest for land, when they've created a land shortage, deliberately causing the price of land to rise. So quite frankly, that's what needs tackling. And I think that compulsory purchase powers in the hands of local authorities are going to be a big, big disincentive for land banking. If, you know, so you set a rule that if you've got a planning and development, even if it's interim planning and you haven't put a spade in the soil within, I don't know, 6 months of acquiring the site, questions should be asked. If it's still the same in 6 months later, CPO it, compulsory purchase it. And I also am in favour of actually there being an audit of what land is available by local authorities in their entire areas, because quite frankly, I'm not sure local authorities now know how much land they've got. And that's partly, again, about taking away all that planning and building responsibility. It's not an area where they've got problems, but we've also got to tackle the government attitude towards planning and development, where local authorities may actually get a lot of pressure from local people saying, we don't want this development here. It's not in our interest. This is what we need. Council says no to the developer. Developer appeals to either the GLA in some instances and other instances to government, and it gets overturned. Who are these people to overturn what is the considered will of local people? So there's a circular thing here about democracy and land ownership and land use that must be considered if we're going to do something about it. It requires some primary legislation, but it also requires local authorities to have the will to do something.
Yeah,
I think local authorities and government as well. Here's some figures which put this into some kind of perspective. There was a recent study of 14 advanced economies, and it showed that in those 14 economies, 81% of house price increases, that's where I got the 81% figure from, between 1950 and 2012 could be attributed by rising land prices. The remainder being attributable to construction costs, etc. In the UK, that figure was 74%. Now, this is why the banks like mortgage and land-related lending. Mortgage lenders pay back a whole lot more than they owe, and land is great collateral. If the borrower defaults, the bank gets the house and the land it sits on, and if the land keeps appreciating in value, the banks, that's why banks make so much money and pay their people so much cash. Now, after the 2008 financial crisis, there should have been a serious fall in land prices. But the major developers, the banks and the government all had an interest in maintaining artificially high book values of developers' land banks. That's the stuff that they own and they've yet to build upon. If they'd allowed them to crash, as happened after any similar previous market busts, many developers would have faced bankruptcy. But the banks chose in the main not to foreclose on their assets, as this would have hastened a downward spiral in land values, not great for them given their exposure to the property market. So I think it's very important to understand the major interests which are actually keeping land values and house prices high. Another one, of course, and one I don't think we talk about enough, is speculation in housing. There's a place near me, where the old Ferrier estate, they built a new estate around there. I know a vaguely left-wing property developer. Some do exist, strangely enough. And he told me that something like 50% of this development had been sold overseas, mostly to Chinese investors. Now, I don't tweet very often. I stuck this up in Twitter, and Barclay Holmes actually called me. And he told me to take the tweet down, saying it wasn't right. So I said, you give me some demonstration, tell me, all right, it's wrong, and I'll take it down. I got nothing. I got another call back about an hour later demanding I take it down. I said to them, you've really picked the wrong guy if you're going to try and intimidate me here, mate. You go ahead and give me the evidence and I'll take it down. I left it up and I've had no evidence since. So, Ruth, what do you think about this? All right, they're building estates basically for speculation. So the resources which could be used to build good public homes are building estates. I think 50% in this stage is a bit of an underestimate. I think actually at the time they built them, something like 60 to 70% were bought for speculation by overseas investors. What do we do about that?
Well, the first thing we need to do is identify who owns what property, because without that, we don't know who does own it. And you're quite right. there's a huge market going on, and all it is people, wealthy people, coming along and buying housing because it's going to increase in value and they don't have to do anything to get a return on it. They don't rent it out very often. They just hang on to the asset. And it's in my view, it's a crime because it does deprive local people of access to things. But the first thing we need to do is find out who owns what properties. I mean, across London, there are huge numbers of properties which are owned by people who don't live in this country and who are just buying up properties and doing nothing with them. So I think identifying where they are, first of all. Then I think we need some legislation which talks about limiting, well, I don't know about limiting, stopping, I think is probably more appropriate, stopping the purchase of property that you're never going to live in. I think if you're buying a property and it's going to remain empty, quite frankly, you shouldn't be allowed to buy it in the first place. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that an awful lot of these are used to launder money. I'm absolutely convinced there is money laundering going on in the property market in London because people are hiding assets from their home countries and using the London property market in the City of London to launder their millions, basically. So we need to put an end to this external influence on the property market in this country and the deprivation of resources to local people. And effectively, they're also, by the way, not paying tax on these things because they don't declare a lot of stuff. So we're deprived all which way round on this. So yes, find out where it is, have a law that prevents it from happening, but those who've got it, take it away from them and take it back to, I think if you're going to give them any compensation, pay them what they bought it for, not what they can sell it for.
I'd go even further than that and pay them the cost of the build, because if the property's not been lived in, then...
Oh, I live with that. I agree with that.
And if that was actually built on land that was originally public sector land that had been donated for the purpose of the delivery of 30 to 40% affordable homes, which may or may not have been delivered at the end of the day, then you take it net of the land value. You pay net of the land value because it was your land to start with. But I think this kind of goes back to what is fundamentally wrong with house building and house planning and the housing market generally, which is that it is developers and landowners that are determining what gets built, where and when, and at most, you're looking at almost a tokenistic amount of consultation with local authorities. Planners' hands are tied for the reasons that Ruth has outlined, and local authorities' hands are largely tied because of the veto that the Minister for State actually holds and wields with monotonous regularity when local communities take exception to the proposals of developers to gentrify their communities. So I would say, once you understand that that's fundamentally the thrust and why this is possible, you then have to think about, well, what kind of legislation do we need? And we have to deal with what we've got, which is a lot of properties that are either not occupied or they're occupied on a transient basis. And we know, for instance, on Canary Wharf, an awful lot of properties that were purchased by overseas Chinese investors are actually occupied by students. And potentially, of course, the students of the people who bought properties, the children of the people who bought properties. But that's obviously not the case everywhere. But if they're not being occupied, if they're not being utilised, then the local authority has to have CPO powers, and CPO powers that also enable a suitable reduction to take into account the costs of undertaking those sorts of procedures and the costs that the local authority has borne in accommodating homeless families at an extortionate amount of money in the private rented sector. That's the kind of legislation that we need. It needs to be punitive and it needs to be restorative.
Looking here at the figures from King's College London, they reckon foreign investment in the UK property market has bumped house prices up by more than 20% over the past 15 years. So this isn't just us as a bunch of lefties having to go with wealthy foreign people. This affects everybody. 20% is significant, particularly when house prices are massively overvalued anyway. Certainly, Ruth is correct regarding money laundering, etc. Having worked in the financial sector, London is a major money laundering centre. And also it's a big centre for tax avoidance, tax evasion, whichever bullshit term you choose to use to go ahead and cover up what is basically theft. We're talking at a time, of course, whenever the war in Ukraine is raging, and I actually teach quite a lot up in Regent's Park, opposite a very big fancy row of Nash terracing, which goes all the way up to Camden Town. I've been teaching there for about 15, 16 years, and I think in all that time we've probably seen about 2 or 3 people we've seen actually in those houses. Quite a lot of Russian money will be invested there, and other oligarch money, because it's a good way of actually, I mean, you're not going to lose your money, and you fix up various complicated structures whereby your ownership of the house can be hidden. All right, so Ruth was talking earlier about who owns the houses. It's very difficult to find out. And also, given the fact that the Russians have given the Tory party so much money over the years, I don't think we're going to be finding out anytime quick. Lorraine,
of course, we've also got our own oligarchs who launder money through the property market as well. Let's not forget we've got our homegrown variety.
Oh no, certainly in terms of crooks and financial speculators, Britain is a world-class nation. There's no doubt about that. Lorraine, tell me about Section 106, which I believe is something that developers use to go ahead and duck their obligations to build an appropriate number of affordable housing on developments.
Yeah, it's Section 106 of the Local Government and Planning Act, I think.
Planning Act.
That's it. So Ruth just covered that. And what it is, it's the requirement on developers to deliver a proportion of affordable homes within any housing development. And most local authorities will set this at somewhere between 30 and 40%. And I think 35% is the policy level for most local authorities in London. What developers will do, first of all, they'll argue for that proportion to be reduced so far as possible, insisting in particular that they can't make their 30% profit if they're delivering those units at those sorts of levels. So that's the first thing they do. They try and get the overall proportion down. And then the next thing they do is they try and go for the most expensive type of affordable home that they can get away with, because the legislation doesn't, or the policies don't generally specify proportion of social rent, London affordable rent and shared ownership. So in the majority of cases, they will go for shared ownership as the option, because the owner only purchases a proportion of the property, and then they're paying rent on the remainder. So they're still getting a very, very high return on the cost of building the property. So that's what they do. And if the local authority won't budge, it goes back to what we were talking about before, they don't develop, but what really sticks in the craw is that local authorities in London, and Royal Borough of Greenwich being one among several, are effectively donating the land for this development. When they're knocking down the Ferrier estate, they're not getting a massive capital receipt for the land. What they're supposed to be getting is the receipt in kind in the form of affordable housing units or social rented units. That's what they should get. And of course, if over 30% of the development cost is gratis because the land has been donated or sold at a very low value, then what you're talking about is a huge amount of public subsidy, effectively for the development of private developers, private landowners, and so on. And what we're not getting as a community is the benefit of that land.
Over to you, Ruth.
Well, of course, the other area of what comes to mind here is what happened on Greenwich Peninsula, where effectively there were Section 106 agreements in place, and the developer just simply refused to deliver it. Now, in order to, enforcing it, there is no real enforcement powers in reality. So the local authorities are left up the Swanee without any means of preventing these developers from doing exactly what Lorraine says, and then reneging on what little is to be done for social housing. And the other thing is that Section 106 doesn't just cover housing, it covers community benefit in a broader way. So, for example, there's no push for, when you get some housing, having community facilities built, local schools built as part of when you're getting new build in undeveloped areas. So you end up, I mean, you look at Greenwich Peninsula, there's a real dearth of infrastructure because nothing was built at the time the properties were built. So Section 106, in my opinion, is a very, very ineffective tool. It's a very ineffective tool because it doesn't give, I mean, the enforcement powers are vague to say at best. And secondly, it doesn't deliver the broad speculation because all the power's in the hand of the developers at end of day. I personally think the local authorities shouldn't be donating land to developers. I think they should actually say, if you want it, market value, but we'll drop the price for every guaranteed contractually agreed group of properties you're prepared to build, or community facilities or whatever it is, that you contractually sign up to, because once there's a contract, it's a different matter. A Section 106 agreement is subject to change. Now, I remember I think it was the East Greenwich part of the peninsula land up there, where the local community were going mad about the developers saying, oh, we can't afford it now because we're not going to make any profit, so we're not going to do it. And they tried every which way to apply pressure to the developer and the local authority, but it all came to naught in the end because the developer has all the power. So if we want to change it, we are going to have much more requirement for land to be used for the benefit of communities than we've currently got, with penalties and with incentives, and sometimes disincentives.
So how would you define disincentives there, Ruth? I'm interested.
Well, for example, if you renege on an agreement you have reached with the local authority should be entitled to remove from your possession X number of properties that have been built for the private sector market. So there's a disincentive, because if they built them for sale, and then they renege on the social housing element of it, if the penalty is they have to give over the equal number of properties that they've built for the sale market, I don't think many developers will want to do that, because the other thing is be aware that this is something that they do. The most polluted, most difficult area, the most isolated, away from facilities and transport, is always where social housing is planned for on these big sites. So, so much for mixed developments, which was the argument we were having through the 80s and 90s about, if you want to it's important actually to mix up communities and have people from a lot of demographic backgrounds living together, mix up the tenure groups.
I mean, you've even had the situation where they've had separate entrances for the social housing tenants if they've, delivered social units within a particular block, or building the social block, the social rented block, away from the rest of the developments, which is what's happening on Kidbrooke Village, of course, rather than actually have them integrated in your mixed sustainable communities, to revert to the parlance of the early noughties or mid noughties. You're actually saying, right, that's where the working class can live. Here, you're not going to live amongst us because we've got a bit of money. You're going to live over there, and you're going to be obvious, and we're going to know who you are. And 9 times out of 10, you'll find the specification in the blocks are to a lower level. The bathrooms ain't quite so nice. The kitchens ain't quite so good. They've got a poorer finish. And sometimes, of course, they'll have been done, built with rather less attention to detail than you get in the high-end properties. So we have to legislate. You've got to make it illegal. You've got to say to developers, if you want to develop any housing at all, 45% or whatever of what you deliver will be handed over to the public sector at cost. There will be no profit. And if there has been a public sector subsidy through the donation or use of land or the cut down price of land, then that will be taken into account in the price when it comes over. You know, it's actually just not giving them the choice. That's the thing. Yeah. Taking the power back.
Absolutely. I think the mentality was summed up very nicely in 1999 when that, what was his name? Fred Manson, Southwark Council's Director of Regeneration. This is a Labour council too. He sparked some controversy in an interview about the Elephant Castle. We're talking about the Haygate here, basically. He claimed that social housing generates people on low incomes coming in, and that generates poor school performances, and middle-class people stay away. So all that talk about mixing communities and so on, that was always completely insincere. They never meant that. They didn't mean a word of that one. And we talked in, I think, episode 2 about the social apartheid which exists in large part of South East London now, particularly in Woolwich. But also when you look at what happened with the Haygate, you had 1,200 council homes there, and in the end with the new development we had something like 70 affordable homes. Let's have a look at some figures here regarding the benefits we get from building. And also I think it's important to note that when we talk about the need for new social housing, this isn't just us as a bunch of lefties talking. There was a parliamentary select committee a while ago that suggested that 325,000 new homes every year are required simply to meet demand caused by demographic change. That wouldn't tackle the current backlog, and it will make things better, but it will take some time to do so. That level of house building hasn't been seen since 1970, when council house building was at its height. And again, it's important to remember here and to note that social house building stimulates the economy and creates good, stable, predictable jobs for the construction industry and the supply chain. Ministry of Housing suggests that for every 1 million of new housing output, you support 20 jobs directly and 16 jobs indirectly. The construction industry as a whole provides employment directly and indirectly for around 10% of the workforce. And of course, the initial costs provide long-term savings. You give people homes and you don't have to pay a huge amount of housing benefit. You can cut out that bill, which is about 3% of public expenditure over the course of 20 odd years. This all seems like a very good idea. Ruth, why do you think we're not doing it? Sum up for me the people and the forces that will get in the way of this.
Well, the biggest force, of course, is finance capital. Finance capital is not interested in anything which is going to reduce profit margins. And anything which impacts on the property market and drops house values, which is one of those things that's happened, or land values, is going to have a huge impact. And of course, as we know, the Tory party is in the pocket of a huge number of these big developers and private interests and people from abroad in the form of donors. And anybody who tells me that there is no influence, it's just donation of money, well, quite frankly, my answer to them is, well, then I'm a cucumber pickle, because it's absolute nonsense, of course. They're buying influence. The second thing is the excuse the Labour Party had for not doing anything about the housing situation when Tony Blair's government was in power, which was about housing costs going on the public sector borrowing requirement, of course, and it was a requirement relating to the EU and keeping everything down to the 3% on GDP. We're no longer members of the European Union now, so there's no excuse for the Labour Party to be standing back on this issue. The third issue is we need to force some transparency in terms of who is dealing with whom, because you've got people behind people in pockets and, all the secrecy that there is around wealth and etc. And one of the things that we can do here is it's actually not that difficult to do some research and find out who's behind who. And we're increasingly seeing the leaks of information about the donations to the Tory party, the developers, and a whole range of other things. But the question is what we do with that information. It is my belief that a large section of the British public have no idea what is going on and what is done in their name. And what we need to do is not only to get that information, we need to get it out there, and we need to have the Communist Party housing policies, which are well founded on looking after the working class people of this country's interest and beyond, out into the hands of local communities. And we should be engaged in, everybody should get involved in local community organising to give local people a voice. Because at the end of the day, I don't care how cynical your Labour MP or your Tory MP is, if you're facing a situation where you're going to lose the vote at the next election, you're going to have to take some cognizance of what people are saying. So I think the three key issues is having a policy to push, researching and exposing what's going on, and thirdly, organising. They're the three keys to the way forward, in my view.
I know we keep on talking about finance capital and the interest in there, but it's very important and we need to go ahead and emphasise this continually. I think you're quite right about the fact that a lot of people don't know what's going on. I think also people feel that there's nothing that we can do about it. 'Twas ever thus, and they've always tried to go ahead and convince people that the way things are is the way they always have been, for some kind of grand cosmic law which we can't go ahead and fight against. We are where we are because of conscious decisions taken by people in the interests of various people who paid them and who continue to pay them. Lorraine, over to you. Concluding comments, please.
Well, really, just to agree with that. I mean, I think the majority of Tory MPs, or certainly a significant number of them, are landlords. There are Labour MPs who are also obtaining revenue from renting out property. So it is in the interest of the political class to do as little as possible in their own interests to get a grip of this situation. It's not on, and it does feel like corruption runs deep throughout the whole of this issue. But, if you think about, I can't believe that they had enough prescience, the Tories, when Thatcher brought the legislation in that has facilitated the situation we're in now. I can't believe they were as prescient to realise just what would happen. But at the end of the day, it's the rentier class, whether that be finance capitalists obtaining interest or whether it be landlords gaining rent and making profit from rent, it is the rentier class that has benefited the most from this, from these changes in legislation in the 1980s and the 1990s. I also think it's just worth reflecting that the amount of public subsidy that goes into home ownership, whether that is buy-to-let home ownership or whether it's owner-occupied home ownership, the amount of public subsidy is one of the things that's driving price increases. And that public subsidy, is met either for private landlords, the amount of initial subsidy that went into the right to buy, and the fact that 40% of all, some 800,000 former council homes are now in the hands of private landlords who are making huge profits out of that. So you've got that. So that's the subsidy. Then you've got the amount of housing benefit, the vast majority of which is now going to benefit private landlords as the second largest form of tenure in the country, and also the most expensive form of tenure in the country, more expensive than home ownership to rent privately in high rent areas. Thirdly, there's the non-taxation of capital gains on primary homes. Now, a lot of people might balk at the thought of having to pay a capital gains tax on their principal home. They might do that because, of course, that's a major source of wealth, both for existing owner-occupiers and also for their descendants who look to inherit from the accrual of value in property. But for the owner-occupiers themselves who don't pay capital gains tax, that's a public subsidy. And most of the subsidy in this country, the majority of the money that is used to subsidise housing in this country is subsidising home ownership, either for rent or to live in. And that's why, one of the reasons why prices are going up as high as they are, that and the willingness of the banks to lend huge amounts of money to cover those price increases on the assumption that prices will always go up. We know they don't. We know they don't. And sooner or later, there will be a crash, whatever the banks want to do about it. Sooner or later, there will be a crash in house prices as we head into, and I think it is inevitable that we will head into recession as a result of the cost of living crisis that we're facing at the moment.
I think it's a very important point to note that one of the reasons why there was suppression of the financial sector and their involvement with the housing market in the years following World War II was people were aware of the impact of, and people had just suffered a major war because they were the impact of some of the great crashes which took place in capitalism. I mean, I'm going too much into interwar history. The Nazis got about 2% of the vote in 1928. In 1932, they got about 27%, and of course, they came to power in 1933 because the financial sector crash meant there was a huge decline in living standards and prospects for working people. So the post-war consensus we had was designed to avoid that sort of thing happening again. Obviously, the financial sector reasserted their power, and we are where we are right now. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to end with a quote from something I put together a while ago, which was basically a Marxist analysis of the housing market. You'll find that on the website for this, along with the housing charter for the party, which I recommend you read very much indeed. You might not want to read my paper, it's huge, but if you read one thing on here, read the housing charter, and we'll put a few other bits of information up there as well, including dealing with some of the major myths about the housing market, such as all the best houses are taken by immigrants. But looking at this paper here, and this actually relates to the conversation we've just had, many of the problems cited above are a function of the global and domestic economy's twisted priorities. These priorities are afforded by the massive levels of inequalities of wealth and income that pervade our societies. The direction of economic activity is determined by the needs and demand of those who carry the most purchasing and investment power. This power is further enabled and perpetuated by the ability of the wealthy to secure political power and manufacture consent through a media made compliant through ownership and threat of withdrawal of advertising revenue or other means. The fight for decent housing and the fight against inequality belongs to the same struggle. You want better housing for all our people? Then you fight the inequities of global capitalism. On that, we have to leave here. This has been CommieCast. We are anti-fascist, anti-racist, but very much for the working class. Thank you very much indeed. Cheerio.